And thank you, Senator Rubio. And I've enjoyed working with you on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which engages in many issues related to their treatment of folks from the Tibetans to the Uyghurs, to their position regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan.
First of all, do you agree that the PRC is the biggest threat that we face as the United States?
Communist Party of China leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin, there's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places, but the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went. And I think you're alluding to it in your statement. I know you may have another question. I don't want to eat up all your time, but I do want to say this. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise. Now, they already are. They're going to be a rich and powerful country, and we're going to have to deal with them. The danger is that because of our own actions, in many cases, a dangerous imbalance is built up in that relationship. We allowed them for years to pretend that they were some developing countries, so we should allow them to continue to cheat on trade and commerce. We should allow them to continue to expand. They lied about not militarizing and populating island chains in the South China Sea and the like. We allowed them for years, before we got serious about it, to conduct grotesque human rights violations against Uyghur Muslims, as an example. One of the most horrifying things happening on the planet. And for years, no one talked about it, which, by the way, not just has a human rights component to it, it allows them to use slave labor to produce goods at the expense of the rest of the world. Talk about not just a horrific humanitarian crisis, but an unfair trade practice as well. We've allowed them to get away with things. And frankly, the Chinese did what any country in the world would do given these opportunities. They took advantage of it. And so I think now we're dealing with the ramifications of it. I agree 100% what you said, but I remind you, and I remind everyone, I guess I want to make this point, that much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
How are you going to explain that to your average American, that we need this all-sides society approach, and to your point exactly, that it needs to begin here at home?
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
Will you support in your role as Secretary of State Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And will you support the porcupine strategy, providing that we will supply them with defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability? By the way, that phrase is from the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. It's in our current law.
Let me just point out that on the Taiwan Relation Act, and I believe of the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple or consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear are our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year, they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan is anywhere near it. So this is just one more example of how they're being excluded. I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on Earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7, 8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, and they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped, and others who have stayed strong in that regard. On the porcupine strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people, or if anyone's watching this, I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the porcupine strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit. We want to discourage that by the Chinese believing that, yes, could they ultimately win an invasion of Taiwan, but the price would be too high to pay. It's basically deterrence. And I think that's critical, not just to defending Taiwan, to preventing a cataclysmic military intervention in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what it would be. And I would make one more point, and again, I don't mean to want to be alarmist about it, but if you listen to Xi Jinping, and it's important when you listen to him, and I say listen, read, don't read the English translation that they put out, because the English translation is never right. You have to read the real translation on what they actually said in their native tongue. What they're basically saying is that this is a foundational and definitional issue for Xi Jinping personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade.
You know, when I went to Taiwan in November and met with the president and other leaders, they are extremely nervous right now. And part of the reason they're nervous is they're concerned about how things play out in Ukraine as possibly creating an incentive for China. And I take your point about the current stalemate and the fact that there is a range of objectives that are out of reach for other side. But I do feel like our partnership with NATO and our continued supply of war material that enable Ukrainians to keep fighting until that resolution is done is extremely important, because if Ukraine collapses, it will say a lot to China about whether we will stay the course in assisting Taiwan. Not to mention, it will be a catastrophe for democracy and a catastrophe for the Ukrainians.
Our goal, as President Trump has stated, is he wants the dying to stop. He wants the killing to stop. So it's very difficult to reach an accord or an agreement that begins with a ceasefire and ends with a peace agreement unless both sides have some leverage. Now, there's some leverage that exists beyond military capabilities as well. We have a significant number of sanctions on the Russian Federation, and they continue to grow and expand, and other nations do as well. And that will have to be part of this conversation in terms of bringing about a peaceful resolution. And then there's the question of the long-term security and stability of Ukraine. Beyond even if the conflict were to end, there needs to be the capability of Ukraine to defend itself. And it's a point that I made back as far as 2014, when the United States under the Obama administration chose not to provide weapon capabilities, and I think we lost deterrent during that period.
I'm going to keep rolling here for a few other questions. One of the things China is doing is deeply engaged in transnational repression, which means threatening people here in the United States that they will disappear or kill or harm their family members back in China if they exercise their free rights here in our country. And also they're seeking to repatriate Uyghurs who have escaped China. And right now there are 48 Uyghurs that are in Thailand, and Thailand is on the verge of repatriating them back to China. Will you lobby for Thailand to not send these Uyghurs back to the horror they will face if they're returned.
Yes, and the good news is that Thailand is actually a very strong U.S. partner, strong historical ally as well, and so that is an area where I think diplomacy could really achieve results because of how important that relationship and how close it is. I think it's also one more opportunity for us to remind the world of what exactly we're talking about here. This is not some obscure issue. These are people who are basically being rounded up because of their ethnicity and religion, and they are being put into camps. They're being put into what they call re-education centers. They're being stripped of their identity. Their children's names are being changed. It's one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened, and they're being put into forced labor, literally slave labor.
And I will say our work together on the Forced Labor Prevention Act, Uyghur Forced Labor, was tremendous. Thank you for championing that. I'm encouraging other nations, including Canada, Mexico, and Europe, to follow the rebuttable presumption strategy we put into that bill, because right now, if our slave labor products or China's slave labor products are rejected here, they're shipped to Canada, and we need to expand on that. I want to turn to another point. Our companies face in China often the requirement for partnerships or location or what products they can produce or the theft of their intellectual property. Meanwhile, we're helping their economy by being a major supplier of fossil gas, LNG, to China. Should we be strengthening the Chinese economy by sending them LNG?
Well, I think that is a good point to raise in that regard, because I will tell you that is one of the things that's going to have to be discussed in the broader relationship with China. And that is, it is one of the things we actually export to China. They import a lot this way. One of the few things that we export is, in great capacity, is these long-term contracts that are tied up either directly to China or through third countries. Because some of this obviously is exported to a third country who in turn sends it to China either as a direct sale or as a byproduct. So I think that has to be on the table as a number of other measures that we have in leverage as we engage the Chinese in this geopolitical perspective. I would go further and point out that the Chinese also have, I believe, the world's largest surplus refining capacity. They've invested very heavily in that as well. And that's one more area where I think our energy policy will be critical in bringing some geopolitical stability to our relationship with them.